home, and kids getting ready back for school this week. I guess it won't be in person. We'll have to be online once again. But such is life during lockdown. We just have to get used to the way it is, and please God, not get used to it. Please God, things will get better, and the world will become a better place, hopefully we learn from all of this to live a more meaningful life and to prioritize what's most important. And in fact, that is the topic we're going to be addressing in today's shiur, which we aptly called, So You Think You Can Have Morality Without God? Think again. That's our topic of discussion today. And I hope you're all keen to learn what's going on. Can you not see the screen? Is it not shared? Let me see what's going on here. Okay, I hope you guys could see it. There we are. Okay, I'm going to go in and out of the slides because I don't have very many slides today. But I do want to focus on our topic because the theme, the subheading is universal morality was and always is a spectacular failure. So in order to really get into it, what I think we should do first is to take a quick look at the Parsha this week, at Parshas Devarim. And in fact, I don't know how many days I'm actually going to dedicate to learning the Parsha because this week is also before Tisha B'Av, it's the 9 days. I think we want to spend some time talking about the period of time we find ourselves in and some of the morals and lessons we could be learning that are very relevant to this time of the year. So we'll spend some time on that as well. But let's just do a quick recap of this week's portion, and we'll pick on a particular theme in the Parsha that I think is something that we should be discussing today. So first, as a quick recap, if you have your book of Devarim with you, the first chapter of Devarim, the very beginning, our first Parsha, and Devarim itself literally means Deuteronomy, that Devarim actually means words. The English translation that they use for the book of Devarim is Deuteronomy, which I think means a repetition. But it's not just a repetition. This is a re-emphasis of what Moshe says, of what the Torah teaches. And therefore, it's honing in for us. It's emphasizing the important messages and lessons that the Torah has for us. So here's a quick, review of this week's portion, which has got a lot of information in it. And we'll just quickly look at it. The first day of Shvat, that's 37 days before Moshe's passing. What was that? Can you just start and see the whole one, please? You guys have to enough. Okay. It's Moshe Rabbeinu passes on the 7th of Adar, and this is the first of Shvat. So it's 37 days before he passes away, and he begins this repetition. So it's the end of his life, and one of the seniors once joked with me. He says, "Rabbi, you know why I come to your classes?" I said, "Tell me." I imagine it's because I'm good at putting people to sleep. So he says to me, "No, the reason I come is because I'm cramming for my finals." I thought it was quite funny and cute. Here it's Moshe's reaching the end of his life. And so he's giving his final message to the people. And this is where he is reviewing. He's telling them everything that happened. Throughout the Parsha, I remember last year we went through some of it. I have a lot of Dale Carnegie lessons that I take from it because Dale Carnegie talks about how we should try to address our messages to people. And it seems like Dale Carnegie rather took a Moshe Rabbeinu course. He's very subtle and gentle in his admonition and his critique. He knows how to do it in a very good way. Even last week's Parsha, we saw already the way he refers to the places that they stopped in, which he calls the 42 journeys. And they're not all real places. Some of those places don't really exist. Some of those places are just made up names just to refer to incidents that happened there as a gentle reminder to the people. For example, when he says to the people, Di Zahav, the place of gold, there was no particular geographic location that we read earlier on in the Torah that was called Di Zahav. But rather, as our sages point out, Di Zahav is a reference to the place where they committed the heinous sin of worshiping the golden calf. And the reason, firstly, that he refers to gently is, it's enough when you just give that look. In fact, I remember a great story Rabbi Tversky always says, how his father told him about what's appropriate, what's menschlich, what's the right behavior that he should be having as, he was the son of a rabbi and his father had certain expectations for him. So in this particular story, he relates that they had a visitor. Another rabbi came to town for Yom Tov, it was Rosh Hashanah. And the rabbi asked him, you want to play chess? He thought to himself, our home, we never play chess on Yom Tov, but the rabbi's offering, okay, let's play chess. So they played a game of chess, and afterwards his father calls him in. And I don't remember exactly how it went, but his father says, it's our custom, we don't play chess on Yom Tov because we want to be more involved in the spirituality and the significance of the high holiday. But then his father looks at him and says, no, did you beat him? So his father knew a very good way to sort of deal with the situation where we have our family standard. We don't play chess in our home on Yom Tov because it's just on Yom Tov we have to be focused on more spiritual matters, not playing chess. But his father knew how to deal with it. So Moshe Rabbeinu here is saying to the Jews, remember that place of Di Zahav. And one of the interesting things I just saw one of the commentaries talking about it is, sorry, this is just getting a little bit complicated here in my office. Just a second. Sorry, guys. And yeah, we're back on. Okay, you can see me, you can hear me. Can't see what's going on. All right, I hope everything's okay. So it's Moshe also in a sense is the defender. He's the faithful shepherd of the Jewish people. So for example, when he's saying Di Zahav, one of the commentaries say that he's saying to the Jewish people, remember the place where you betrayed God worshiping in golden calf. But another commentary says he's actually telling God, you're blaming the Jews for worshiping the golden calf. Remember that metaphor we used last week from the Zohar about the prostitute, the harlot, who the king hires to try to seduce his child? Moshe Rabbeinu sort of flips that kind of metaphor and says, God, whose fault is it? What do you think? If you're going to put a prostitute in front of a young man, he's not going to succumb? And he says, you gave them all that gold. So sort of God, it's your fault. He sort of he was advocating for the for the people. And of course, we always have to learn from Moshe Rabbeinu. They say, treat your friends like a fine piece of art. Always put them in the right light. And the story that comes to mind with that is a story of the Chassam Sofer. Rabbi Moshe Sofer was a great rabbi in Pressburg in Germany. And he once had a meeting of rabbis and he wanted to show them this particular rare coin. He wanted to show them something special about the coin. And so he called the rabbis were coming for a meeting. And at the meeting, he wanted to show them this rare coin. But unfortunately, in the middle of the meeting, the coin disappeared. He was quite disappointed. He asked, did anybody take the coin? Where is the coin? And eventually he said, they searched everywhere in the room. They couldn't find it. And eventually he says, I'm really sorry to have to do this, but it's a very expensive rare coin. And maybe because he borrowed it from somebody, I'm not exactly sure why. He says, we're going to have to do an inspection. It's embarrassing to have to do this to rabbis, but I'm going to have to check everybody's pockets. One of the other rabbis said, why don't we wait a few minutes? Let's just wait a couple of minutes. Give it some time. So the rabbi says, okay, fine, we'll wait a few minutes, nobody leave. And they continued their meeting. But of course, it wasn't very pleasant when the coin went missing. But sometime soon, the maid came in after cleaning up the table. She noticed that the coin, she found that while she was cleaning, the coin had fallen into a napkin, into a serviette. So Rabbi Sofer then asked the other rabbi who asked him to wait off on checking everyone's pockets. Why did you ask that? So the rabbi said, actually, I have a very similar coin to that I have in my pocket. And he went on to show them this similar coin that he had in his pocket. And he says, I got this coin too. I also wanted to discuss it at the meeting, but whatever this was about this coin that was somehow fascinating to them or relevant to their meeting that day. And he said, just imagine you went checking the pockets and you would find it in my pocket. My reputation would be gone. So I asked that you waited because I realized there must be some way, some other mistake going on here. So again, the story I'm not exactly sure how I'm connecting this, but of course the story tells us how we have to always treat our friends like fine art and put it in the right light and see people in the right way. Another story that comes to mind, my wife told the kids at the Shabbos table, great story about a rabbi who was invited to a bar mitzvah of a family of a kid they weren't very involved in their Yiddishkeit. And this is an old time story. What happened was there was a silver spoon that disappeared. The caterer was doing a count of all their cutlery, and they noticed a silver spoon, real proper fancy sterling silver spoon that disappeared. It's expensive. And the caterer says to the host, something's wrong. We have to check who took a silver spoon. In the meantime, they do an inspection. They're checking every single guest's bags and pockets before they leave the function. Can't have this function where a silver spoon disappears. The only person that didn't check was the rabbi, and they couldn't find the spoon. And they concluded, it's very sad and strange that the rabbi would take the spoon, but what could we do? A little while later, the parents of the bar mitzvah boy met with the rabbi. They already settled the bill with the caterer. They paid for the spoon. And when they meet with the rabbi, they had to get the host says, I have to get it off my chest. There was a silver spoon that went missing at the bar mitzvah. Maybe you could tell me you have an idea where it is. He said, sure, I know exactly where it is. It's inside your son's tefillin bag. Has he been putting on his tefillin? Had he been putting on his tefillin, you would have found it right away. So this was the rabbi's way of sort of putting them in a position where they have to do what they have to do. And so I'm digressing very far from the topic that I said we're going to discuss today, because I said we'll summarize the parsha very quickly. But these two little stories just show about the way that we have to deal with people. And Moshe Rabbeinu, what he's doing in our parsha is not only is he reviewing the various events that occurred and telling us about the laws that were given in the course of the journey and the 42 stops and the 40 years, he's reaching the end of his life. He's entitled to pull any punches he wishes, but he does so gently. He knows the Jews are about to enter the promised land. He's not even going to go with them. So he sees this opportunity to reprimand them, to rebuke them, but in the most gentle way possible. And he was reminding them, as you're going to go into the land of Israel, how you should keep the Torah and you should observe the mitzvahs, follow the commandments of Hashem. And it's important, you don't want the land to spit you out, because that's what would happen if, God forbid, we ignore the laws of the Torah. And he makes it very clear to them the importance of that. And he recalls the various events. If you look through the parsha, you'll see the appointment of the judges and the magistrates, how exactly his father-in-law Yisro recommended that would ease his burden of ruling, of determining justice for the people and teaching them the word of God. And we read about the journey from Mount Sinai all the way through the desert, all these 40 years and all the incidents and everything that occurred, from the story of the spies that prevented them from entering the land, which caused them to be stuck there for 40 years. And he even says, you guys rebelled against me and God was angry with you. And he talks about God got angry with me when I had to hit the rock instead of talking to it. He talks about all the various events. And the one I want to focus on today is an instruction that Hashem gives to Moshe in our parsha. And this particular instruction is an important message for us, because here, as we see in the parsha, he reviewed all these things: leaving Egypt, receiving the Torah, wandering in the wilderness all these years. And by the time of our parsha, at the beginning of the book of Devarim, we're ready to enter the land. And Moshe's got to give them the instructions of what they need to know. And that's why he's telling them all firstly and giving them the instructions, and he's giving them encouragement. Critique can't just be the criticism for the sake of criticism. And we know the rules: don't criticize, condemn, or complain. But he did find it necessary to tell them what they needed to hear and remind them what their job was to do, what they needed to do. Now, most of the information are things that we already know. Okay, we've read them in the previous parshas. That's Deuteronomy, it's repetition. But here, it's added. There's an addition. There's a new way of understanding it that Moshe tells them. You know, the ancient Chinese proverb that says you have to tell people what you're going to tell them, and then say it, and then tell them what you said. That's sort of what's going on here, and that's why another word for devarim in the holy tongue is Mishna Torah. Mishna Torah is the repetition of the Torah. That's why they call it Deuteronomy, because it's a repetition. Yes, it's a trip down memory lane that we discuss, the review of everything. And Moshe is telling them all these events, including the mistakes, and telling, the only way you're going to stop yourself, what did Einstein say? Insanity is repeating the same thing again and again and expecting different results. You don't want the same results. Don't repeat the same mistakes. So that's what Moshe is doing. He's telling them, learn from your mistakes. That's what it is. So if you have a chumash in front of you, take a moment, and we're going to read the beginning of the parsha. I want to read the beginning of the parsha with you, just the verses. Let's start off in the text itself. Eile hadevarim asher diber Moshe el kol bnei Yisrael. These are the words that Moshe spoke to all of Israel on that day, the Aver Hayarden, on the other side of the Jordan River, the Midbar in the wilderness, Ba'arava. He's giving us the geographic location, exact location. Today, we have a lot more students here today. Right now, we have 27 people in the Zoom room, plus we have several participants on Facebook and on YouTube. And right here, I have a whole audience in my office of the Kievman crew. So a lot more participants. All right, great. Moshe had a lot more than that going on. So it's telling us the location of where this all was. And like I said before, this location is not all necessarily geographic places. Like we said, Di Zahav is a reference to the place where they betrayed God with the gold, which we discussed in detail earlier. And the Torah says it is 11 days journey from Chorev by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. So really, this shouldn't have taken them very long to get from Chorev, which is Mount Sinai, to Israel. 11-day journey, that's it. But this is 40 years later, in the 11th month. Which is the 11th month? Let's think of the months of the year start in the Hebrew calendar with Nisan. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Teves, Shvat. Shvat is number 11. The 12th month is Adar, and that's why in a leap year, which this coming year will be, we add an additional month at the end of the year of Adar. Now, think about Adar. It's the polar opposite of the current month of Av, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, hopefully. Av is a very sad month, and Adar is the most joyous month in our calendar. And that's the month, though, that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. It's also the month of his birth. So here is this is just the context of where we are. And Hashem tells him these words. It says, Hashem tells him to explain very well, Be'er Heitev, the words of the Torah. Now, the verse seems to imply that Moshe is only now, the start of the fifth and final book of the Torah, is Moshe Rabbeinu beginning to explain the Torah to them. What's going on here? I mean, he's with the Jews all these years in the desert. Only now he's starting to explain the Torah. But we know, of course, that he's been teaching the Torah all this time, right? They heard God speak the Torah, that give them the commandments at Mount Sinai. And they've been traveling 40 years together. So what does this mean when this verse says that Moshe is to teach them the Torah, to explain it to them? So, of course, we have to look at Rashi, the foremost commentator of the Torah. And in fact, our sages teach us that the explanation, what does this mean that Moshe is teaching them the Torah bar Heitev? Just a moment, please. So what does this mean that Moshe is teaching it to them? Why at this point, as they're just about to enter the land of Israel, which we said before, of course, an old person wants to tell his kids, his grandkids, his his students, his disciples. He wants to tell them all the things he really wants to get off his chest after all these years leading them, and maybe the frustrations and the struggles and the challenges he had with them. But there's more to this, as Rashi tells us. Rashi says, actually, that Hashem tells him to, to tell the people they have a job to do before they get to Israel. And that is to translate the Torah into 70 languages. Why 70 languages? Well, we're told that there were 70 nations in the world, or 70 languages of the people in the world. So, of course, we wonder here, what's going on? Why is Moshe at this point all of a sudden translating the Torah as at least according to this commentary, that Moshe is translating the Torah here into 70 languages? What for? What's the reason for this? Okay, what was the immediate benefit of him translating the Torah into 70 languages here? For 40 years, they learned from Moshe. They're learning the Torah in the original language, in Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue that God gave us, the Torah, the language of the Jewish people. So that's the language they understood. They spoke Hebrew. Why do you have to translate it from Hebrew into French, into Russian, into Portuguese, into Spanish, into Afrikaans, into Zulu, into Xhosa, into, I don't know, all the languages? Okay? For what reason? Now, one answer is that the translation, the act of translation, it fits with the general theme of the book of Dvar, which is they're preparing to enter the land. So the next stage of their journey, they have to translate. They're going to meet other people. Maybe they need to understand there must be some reason for this. Life in the desert before they go into the land of Israel, it was just the Jewish people themselves, and they were living this purely miraculous existence. For 40 years, the people lived day and night with miracles, as we've been reading throughout the Torah. The water came from a rock. The food fell from heaven. Moshe received the word of God in the Ohel Moed, in the tent of meeting. Everything was miraculous. They experienced God's presence with them, close and direct all the time. That's it. It was right there before them. Now they're entering the land, and we know the story of the spies, and at least according to the Hasidic interpretation, which their mistake was thinking that they could just live this spiritual lifestyle in the desert. So now they knew that's not going to be their existence anymore. You're coming to the land of Israel, you're going to have to do the mitzvahs in the real land. They're going to have to work the land to eat. They're no longer going to experience those open miracles. And their faith is going to be put to the test. They're going to be foreign nations with strange beliefs. They're going to be, look at Israel today. And back then, this is exactly what Moshe is preparing them for. Times are coming in which they are going to have to know how to adapt. There are going to be struggles and challenges. And they might get a little bit lost on the way. They might lose touch with the language of their own souls. And in such circumstances, what the people will need to know, what they're going to need is, they're going to have to know that the Torah speaks not only to those who witnessed the daily miracles back in the desert, but also to those who have to be guided back to God. And as Jews are dispersed around the world, and we know that's exactly why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi went and took the oral tradition and put it into a book called the Mishnah, and then came the Gemara, and then came the various comments, because he realized we're going to be dispersed everywhere in the world. So the idea is that they will need a Torah that speaks their language in every sense of the term. And this is why, perhaps, we'll discuss this and dissect it and look at it a little bit deeper. But this is perhaps why Moshe foresaw in our parsha that he has to translate the Torah into all these languages in order for it to be relevant, so to say, everywhere in the world. So Moshe wasn't just caring for the flock of his time who spoke the holy language, who experienced the wonders and miracles, but realizing the future generations, which of course we have to be thinking forward as well. You drive in your car, perhaps I should leave this metaphor for tomorrow's year, where we talk about the emphasis of the 9 days, but the idea I hope you don't mind if I repeat it again in a different context tomorrow, that in the car you're driving, you do look back because the past is what informs the future. But to look back, we look inside a rear view mirror, which is very small. To look forward, we look at our windshield, which is a big view ahead. We have to see the bigger picture ahead, but we always have to be able to look back in the past. Moshe Rabbeinu, looking back in the past and seeing the errors, the mistakes, the struggles, all the problems we've had, that's what informs him to look ahead and to see in the future. And so Moshe realizes that in the future, they're going to need it, not just in the language that they speak today, but the languages that they're going to speak in the future as well. But the thing is that it's not just limited to, obviously, you have to have an eye on the future, and we have to see that there's times to come. But again, we asked this question before, what's the immediate benefit? What's the immediate benefit for right now for the Jewish people? Why do they need to translate the Torah immediately now? So this is a good question, I think. And it's one we're going to have to analyze and discuss in greater detail to understand this. Because in one sense, Judaism in general and the teachings of the Torah, it seems, if you just look at it very plain and simple, it's instruction of God to the Jewish people at that time, and of course to the future. We all know Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. We don't go out there telling people that their beliefs, that their faith is wrong. We believe that each person has their purpose in the world. And when we say, what does it mean to be the chosen nation? Chosen to follow the Torah. We are chosen to follow the Torah. And other people have their beliefs and their systems. Of course. Guys, please. Okay, just a second, ladies and gents. Afterwards. Okay. So the idea that, of course, the Torah is, yes, it's relevant. Torah is relevant, yes, for the Jewish people, but does the Torah have a message for mankind beyond the Jewish people? Now, there's no obligation for other people to keep the 613 commandments of the Torah, right? But there are teachings in the Torah that aren't only relevant to the Jewish people. Therefore, the commentaries tell us, okay, just a sorry, guys. Okay, so the idea then is that Torah's message is not only one for ourselves, and that's perhaps another way to see it, that the Torah's message is something for all of mankind, for every civilization that exists. There is a message within the Torah. The Torah's message is universal. So what aspects of the Torah are universal? What is it that's relevant to the Jewish people? So Maimonides says that there were 6 laws, 6 precepts that were taught, that were given to Adam Arisha, the very first human being. What were they? Number 1 is the prohibition against worshiping false gods. Number 2 was the prohibition against cursing God. Number 3 is not to murder. Number 4, no incest or adultery. Number 5, not to steal. And number 6, to have to establish laws and courts of justice. Now that was 6 laws, 6 universal laws at the very beginning of creation. Later on in the story of Noah, in this ark that you see right here, well, I don't know if it was exactly this, Google's image of it, there's lots to choose from. This was a very dramatic one, is the 7th law, which is called Eiver min hachai, not to eat flesh from a living animal. Okay? So that's the 7 Noahide laws that are known. Now, while these might seem, of course, that are, the universal laws, but they're in the Torah. And as the law states, this is something that's for all people. Every single human being. Maimonides discusses this. Please, okay. Maimonides discusses this and talks about how these laws are basically for every single human being, and anyone who keeps these basic laws actually has a place in the world to come. Okay, so very nice. But if Judaism, if we're not seeking out converts, then why do we have these laws to begin with? Can't we just say, let humanity live their life, let the people of the world live how they want? Why do we have to have laws in our Torah that is for the rest of mankind? Okay? Of course, we're all created in the divine image. We all have a divine purpose and mission in this world. So, if that's the case, the way Maimonides puts it is, we can't just mind our own business. So you have to find that balance now. You're on the one hand, we're not proselytizing to others, but we realize if we all have a divine purpose in this world, then the Torah's message cannot be one that's only just for the Jewish people. There are messages within Torah for all the nations of the world. Every single person, every human being, every person created in the divine image has obviously a divine purpose and mission in this world. Of course, one could say live and let live. But that's not a Jewish thing. As much as we hear that idea of live and let live, the Torah teaches that we can't stand by if we see someone's about to get hurt and we have the ability to prevent it. If you remember a few months ago, I gave you a shir. This shir was the story about Genevieve. I'm forgetting her first name. It was a woman in New York who was murdered and according to the New York Times reporter, the journalist who was reporting on this and interviewed so many people, there was something like 37 people who witnessed this murder, and it took about 30 minutes till anybody called the police. Why? Because the rationale that people had was, I'm not going to mix in. I don't want to interfere. I don't want to get involved. It's not my business. So what Rambam is telling us here with these 7 Ohad laws is that every single human being has certain basic requirements. And therefore, we as Jewish people have to spread the awareness of these laws because we want all of humanity to have a certain level, a certain conscience, Hitler Yamach Shema said about the Jewish people that we brought a conscience to the world. So if we realize we're all created in that divine image, and indeed, we do have a responsibility. We're not proselytizing. We're not saying anybody's imperfect in their beliefs. But we certainly believe that there's a significance, there's an importance that we have in these laws that are relevant to all of mankind. They are universal. And therefore, the commentaries tell us that is the reason why Moshe translated the Torah even in his generation. It wasn't only that the Torah is relevant to his times. He saw ahead to the future generations who wouldn't speak the holy tongue. But the commentaries are telling us it's not only about our people, but he was realizing that the Torah's message is universal. There are messages and lessons from the Torah that everyone could learn from. And therefore, in our parsha, the very, very beginning, we see that Moshe is teaching it to the Jewish people and telling them we have to translate the Torah into all these languages. For what reason? To bring its universal message. Because every single person is created in the divine image, in the image of God. And therefore that message has to be translated into all the languages so everyone could find its message for them. Now, of course, throughout history, people wonder whatever happened. This wasn't something the Jewish people were necessarily preaching, and we weren't. Not just to think about it. We lived amongst the nations of the world for millennia, and unfortunately, throughout our history, in many places, many countries, we have been persecuted, and we've been going through difficult times. It's one of the great miracles of our time today, the 21st century, that we're not living with the anti-Semitism, even though it exists, no doubt. Don't kid yourself, it exists. But I think it's one of the first times in history where other nations of the world are somewhat open to hearing the message of the Torah from the Jewish perspective, from the Torah perspective. So, of course, we have to be willing to share that message with the world as well. So, why do we need the Torah to teach us these laws? Maybe, and one perhaps could say, aren't these basic human laws not to steal, to have a system of courts and maintain justice in the world? What do we need Moshe's translation for? Maybe the Torah could stay in the holy tongue, and in each society, in its own language, it could come to the logical conclusion that murder is wrong. But we know that it's not so simple. It's not so simple. It's not so simple that, guys, you see I'm in the middle of a shir, so I don't mind. I love for you guys to be in here, but you can't disturb, okay? Please. So why was it necessary then to have this translation done in the 70 languages? Right? If every human being is created with a conscience, don't we all know these basic laws of life? Don't steal, don't kill, these are basic laws that everybody should understand. It's universal. And if that's the case, why can't we rely on the conscience of mankind to live in a moral society? Can we not just rely that everybody would do the right thing? But here's perhaps another way to think about it. You ever counted your change after leaving a store and you noticed that perhaps they gave you more than you should have, or maybe they shortchanged you? We probably notice more when they shortchange us. And what do you tell yourself? That the mistake was the cashier's? No one's going to ever come chasing you for it. It's not your fault. It's not your problem if they gave you more money than necessary. And does it really matter? I mean, it's Pick and Pay. It's Woolworths. They have millions of brands anyhow. We could think of lots of instances in life. How about the time somebody needed a ride and it wasn't out of our way, but we found the perfect excuse why we couldn't do it. I've seen this, maybe even myself. And on the other hand, I remember as a kid, one of my classmates, one of my friends who we became good friends with because of this, was Bedikas Chametz night. I'll never forget this. It's the night before Pesach, and my father went out to get pizza for us because, the house is already Pesachdik. It's all cleaned, and we're doing the last minute touch-ups. We still have to search for the chametz. My father went to get us pizza so we could have a pizza supper outside and make sure that we finish up with cleaning the house. And on the way, he sees another member of our community, this classmate of mine's family, that was stuck on the road. Their car had some trouble. My father brought home the mother and the 3 kids, while the father stayed, waiting for the equivalent of the AA in the US. We call it the AAA, the Automobile Association, to come help them out. And what I found quite amazing was, my father went and got extra pizza that everybody was taking care of. And of course, my friend and I became good friends from this little experience. Now you think about it, it's Erev Pesach. It's one of the busiest days on a Jewish calendar. And I give my father that credit and sometimes think, can we not go out of our way to help somebody out? It's not always easy. Sometimes we make up good excuses and we have good reasons why not to. I will tell you a story that happened last week. One of our senior citizens called me up and asked me to call Hatzalah because she wasn't feeling well. I said to her, do me a favor, you call Hatzalah, because if I call, even though I'm part of Hatzalah, I'm not with you. I don't know what's going on. I don't know your symptoms. I don't know your exact location. And anyways, she called Hatzalah. I tried to keep in touch a few hours later and discovered she was gone. She was no longer amongst the living. Very, very sadly so. And then I was looking through my messages. She messaged me earlier in the week telling me she's going through some other trouble. She was evicted from her apartment and whatever other troubles. I don't know if I could or couldn't have done anything. I myself was in quarantine, COVID. But yesterday at our funeral, I decided to tell everybody the story in the Gemara. Because I believe, I don't know if myself or others would let somebody down. And the story in the Gemara is sort of a feel-good excuse, but what I told everybody present, family and friends and everybody who was there, the Talmud relates the story about two great sages, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish himself is a person we've discussed many times, lessons we can learn from him, because he was previously a highway robber who became a great rabbi. I don't know if he was Jewish to begin with and became a Baal Teshuvah, or if he wasn't Jewish but somehow was inspired. And from being a highway robber, he became a great rabbi. And one day he and his brother-in-law, because as the story goes, Rabbi Yochanan, who he was robbing one day, got into conversation with him. And Rabbi Yochanan managed to convince this robber to divert his talents from robbing people to becoming a great sage and scholar. And he complimented Rabbi Yochanan and said, "What a muscular fellow, you're so good looking, you're so Sarah, what were you telling me the other day that I am?" So he says to him that use your good looks for others. So Rabbi Yochanan says, you think I'm good looking, you should meet my sister. And eventually he introduced his sister to Reish Lakish, and they got married. So they became brothers-in-law, and they became sparring partners a little bit in the study hall. And they would study together and argue together. There's many debates between them in the Talmud. And one day they were going on a trip. They were going to the Chamei Tveria, what we call here Bela Bela, warm baths. In Israel, if you go to Tiberias, there are what's called the hot springs of Tiberia. It's like the spa of Israel. They have these sulfur pools, and it's a place, I've never been to them, but what I'm told is if you go to these pools in Israel, it's very relaxing. Actually, I've been to the sulfur pools at the Dead Sea, at the En Gedi Spa. So I've never been to the hot springs of Tiberias yet. I do have to experience it one day. So perhaps one of these days we could get a trip going to Israel when Israel will open its doors to us and allow South Africans back in. We're a red country today. You can't get to Israel as a South African. So if we get to Israel, we could perhaps go to the Chamei Tveria. And the sages were accustomed, I don't want to say accustomed, they were approached by a schnorrer. Every country has its unique personalities. In Israel, we have Jews of all stripes and colors. Every type of Jew from all over the world. You cannot say that Judaism is any one race. We Jews have been dispersed around the world. We have all types of Jews and cultures, and there's a unique brand of schnorrer, of beggar in Israel. And this beggar comes up to the rabbis and asks them for some alms, some help. And the rabbis say, we're busy now. We're on our way to the spa. When we come back, we'll help you out. And as you may have heard the story from me before, sadly, when they came back, they finished their spa treatment. You go into the gym, you have your appointment, you have to be there on time. But when they left, they remembered the guy that said they're going to help him out. And they came to the place where he was before, but unfortunately, he was now no longer amongst the living. They felt really bad. Right away, how it starts, your conscience starts feeling, goodness gracious, what could I do? What could I have done? What should I have done? How could I have helped this guy out? I can't believe it. I'm at fault here. And all of a sudden, they're feeling really, really bad. And of course, they decided, instead of spending the rest of their life in therapy about what they could have done and should have done, they decided instead to help him now. They said, we couldn't help him while he was alive. Let's at least try to help him now that he's dead. How do you help a dead person? Well, the first thing is to make sure he gets a proper burial. And there's a procedure called tahara. And so they began to remove his clothing from him so they could immerse him in the mikveh. They didn't have to go to a mikveh. They're in Tiberias. Tiberias is on the Kinneret River. So they'd be able to put him into the Kinneret River, make sure his body's cleansed, and prepare for his burial. But as they were undressing him, they came to the realization that this person was no pauper as he pretended to be. He actually was loaded with gelt, lots of shekels in his pockets. And therefore, they actually realized it wasn't their fault that this person was was asking for money and they didn't help him out, they were able to have that clear conscience. It wasn't their fault that he died. He had his illness, whatever it may have been, and he's asking for money even though he's loaded with money. The point, of course, is that we come to a realization that sometimes we make excuses not to help people out for whatever reason. The truth is, you start saying the person can take an Uber these days. We don't want to take people in our cars. Who knows what? But then you realize what we should be doing to go out of our way to help somebody out. In one way or another, whatever excuses we make for ourselves, our minds are easy to persuade. We're able to convince ourselves that, for whatever convenient reason, we weren't there to help the person. And when we set the rules for ourselves, when we set the rules as being honest, it's our own rule. And we decide when we can break that rule. And we decide how we want to apply the rule. Of course, we're capable of doing the right thing. But when we're left to our own devices, there's no guarantee that we will do the right thing. Our decision-making is usually influenced by how we feel at that given moment. Our minds are in constant danger of being bribed by our emotions, which leads us to that never-ending cycle of rationalizing, of making up excuses. We come up with all kinds of reasons, good reasons, sometimes not good reasons, sometimes just being lazy. We justify our decisions. We could break our own rules because we made up these rules. So how do we go beyond that? What can we do to realize that our whatever reasons or excuses we make, are they breakable or not? And this is, I think, the idea that the Torah is telling us here. There is a systematic way to make the right choices. And that is the concept of a higher authority, of realizing that not everything I do just is based on what I say. The Torah tells us God does not take any bribes. So the key to making the right choices in all aspects of our lives is to have rules that don't come from our own minds, that are wishy-washy, that are capricious sometimes, but from something that's beyond ourselves, something that cannot be bought off, cannot be corrupted. It's very nice to see we have laws in this country, and even a president could go to jail, a former president, for bribery and corruption and all the other shenanigans. But this is what we have to realize, that when it comes to, look what's going on around us right now. People aren't happy with the law, so they're demonstrating, so they're protesting, so they're deciding. But we have an awareness of the divine law. We realize that we are going to be judged justly for our actions, and that comes from above, and that God knows what's going on. And history has shown us that relying just on our own intelligence and our own sophistication and our own human mind, it's led to great tragedies. Think of the Holocaust. 6 million of our people were slaughtered by a very morally advanced nation. The German people, very sophisticated, scientifically advanced, mathematics, every aspect of their lives. I want to share with you something fascinating I came across last night from William Tucker, talking about the science and politics of racial research. And he says the Holocaust has commonly been conceived of a revolt against reason, the ultimate example of the irrational, designed and executed by the pathologically insane. People think, right? But if reason was the object of the revolt, it was also the chief ally, a dialectic so monstrously rational that it could override all the traditional bounds of morality. And therefore he says the Holocaust was not so much the overthrow of reason as its triumph over morality. It allowed a scientific ultra-rationality, what Hitler called ice-cold logic. That's what allowed the murder. Because to the Nazis, to the Nazi party, to all the people who bought into it, you think about it, it's so easy to say, how could they? This was a morally advanced people. And yet, those very same people allowed the murder of millions of people, allowed for almost the extinction of our people, and so many others. So, how could that happen? the teachings of the Rebbe, he says, it's when people use their own mind, their own logic and reason. It's their own human moral compass. And unfortunately, that could go wrong. So the idea then that we submit to a higher authority, that we don't just do things based on the way we see and understand, but based on a higher calling. If we implement the idea of a higher judge into the way we live our lives, the way we educate our children, then there'll be a fear of heaven. And it will help their moral compass to stay true, even in the face of the greatest temptations that a person could experience and could see. And that's really what we have to realize, is I want us to recognize that there is a master of the world. That's what's important. There's a letter from the Rebbe, 1981, when President Reagan and 3 others were shot in Washington. They were, it was before my time, so I don't know exactly what was going on, but it was outside the Washington Hilton Hotel. And shortly after this incident, this assassination attempt, the Rebbe was hosting a Farbrengen. You can watch a video of it. The Rebbe gave this impassioned talk about what had happened at that time and what needs to be done to combat crime in our society. And what he said, I want to read to you a few lines. He spoke, of course, in Yiddish. Okay, this was, it's published in Sichos Kodesh, in the letters of the Rebbe, but this is from 1981. And he says as follows: the reason a person could come to perpetrate such an act is because they're not permeated with faith as they should be. By this, we mean the simple faith that there's a creator, a master of the world, who observes the actions of every single individual. So we have to, let me read a few more lines of what he says here. This negates the assumption that one is allowed to do whatever they want, that you just have to be smart enough to carry out your plan to hurt others. In fact, this hurts oneself possibly even more than it hurts others. The others experience only bodily pain, whereas the perpetrator damages his body and his soul in this world as well as in the next. So what's the Rebbe telling us here? Very, very simply, that when a person is God-fearing, then there's a higher moral compass that they look up to. Like King Solomon said, and we say this in every funeral. We say these same words over and over, and I remind us, Ein tzaddik asher yaseh tov v'yechta. There's no righteous person in this world who does only good and never sins. We were created as human beings. We're not angels. No one's perfect. But a God-fearing person, when we are inculcated with an education, you want to call it brainwashing? Fine. Do we brainwash our kids? Perhaps. But maybe our brains need to be washed sometimes. And we give them that wanting to strive for truth, to pursue the right choices. And therefore, it's not just for our children's sake, for our own sake, we all need that. So, of course, there are many levels of God-fearing, of Yirat Shamayim, fear of heaven. But the most basic notion of being God-fearing is to understand that there's a higher authority out there, that there are consequences to our actions. The reward and punishment, they're foundations of our faith. And so going back to our discussion earlier, this is what we share with the world. No, the world does not have to keep all our 613 mitzvahs. But I think that Judaism has a lot of universal messages. When we read in Pirkei Avos, we read in Ethics of Our Fathers the other day. What does the great sage say? If you consider 3 things that you will not come to sin, what are they? Know that which is above you. Ayin ra v'ozen shamas. There's an eye that sees and an ear that hears. And all of our deeds are recorded in a book. So the truth is that eye that sees and the ear that hears It's not negative consequences. It's not about the punishment. We could apply that equally in the positive sense. The most basic incentive for doing acts of goodness and kindness, Pirkei Avos talks about it. It's a basic idea of rewarding people. No good deed goes unnoticed. We have to reward people, shower them with rewards, incentives. The Talmud tells us that one of the great sages, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, said that Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekapeach schar kol bria afilu schar sichanat, that Hashem does not deprive any creature of the reward, even the reward for simply speaking nicely, sichanat, nice talk, being pleasant in the way we speak. So I think there's a lot of ideas we discussed today, a lot of ideas that we can unpack, and realizing in general that what we do, everything we do, positive, negative, all has its consequences, its results. Even if we know we were talking before, treat a friend like a fine piece of art, always put them in the good light, always to see things in the positive way. And therefore, I think there's a lot. We got to pack it. We got to put it all together. But the idea that everything we do to realize it's not just about fear of punishment or retribution, retaliation, revenge, but we do the right thing because it's the right thing. When we don't listen to our own moral compass or conscience, then we compromise our integrity. But we have to realize that our own moral compass should be guided by the Torah. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu translated into the 70 languages, because this is something that's relevant not just to ourselves, but to all people. And therefore, I think if people could find the messages and lessons that are relevant to themselves in that. You know what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, we talked a lot about him months ago. He was very relevant to the story, the destruction of the temple. He said that, I don't know where they're going to take me. He was a great sage. He didn't know where they're going to take him in the next world. He said, and his final words to his students, it's quite fascinating. Let me just find it in the Gemara quickly here. It's actually the very beginning of the Talmud in Tractate Brachos. Just to share with you this idea. His students said to him, Baruchenu, please bless us, our teacher, Rabbeinu. Amar Lahem, he said, may it be God's will that you fear heaven the same way that you fear human beings. And his students said, is that everything? He says, you should hope to have so much fear. You know that when a person sins, he hopes that nobody sees, nobody will catch him. He said, if we fear God in the same way, we would never sin, because God sees everything we do. It's not the feeling of shame or guilt that's important. On the contrary, we realize, that of course could sometimes be counterproductive if we're living our life constantly in fear. But the constant awareness of God's presence, it should put us in touch with how we truly wish to see ourselves. That am I an upstanding person with integrity? Not just because of my own way of seeing things, but from the divine perspective. That dignity. Yes, we talked about healthy pride previously. And that these all could be guiding ways of living our life in a proper way. And so, my friends, that's the idea I wanted to share. I think there's plenty more I have that does come to mind, but I think some of you have other things going on in the day. But the bottom line, the Unta Shashura, one of the psukim, one of the verses that the Rebbe taught that kids should know is V'hine Hashem nitzav alav. You guys want to sing it? Hine Hashem nitzav alav. If a person didn't just rely on themselves, but constantly with the realization of God's presence in our lives, in Shulchan Aruch, it starts over the words that a person should constantly be aware of God's presence all the time. Then of course we realize we're in the constant presence of Hashem. than we, I think, would be behaving. Just imagine if you were in the presence of greatness, whatever definition of greatness you have. A great person is in your presence. How would your behavior be? And all the more so in the presence of the Almighty, of the King of all kings. So just think about that. Think about how we could influence society around us. As Rabbi Goldman likes to say, every rabbi has only one sermon. It's their reputation. It's who they are. And I think each one of us has to constantly make those decisions, what's right, what's wrong. And those are some of the thoughts that come to mind in today's shiur, how we could try to live our lives in the most meaningful, beautiful way. And of course, to influence those around us as well, that each of us realize that we have that personal relationship with Hashem, and to realize that the Torah contains that blueprint for humanity to live in this world and to that harmony that we need to have in this world. And so if we have that awareness of God's presence in our lives, and we live on God's compass, not on our own mind, and we have that awareness that there's a God who created the world and that we're indispensable to God's plan, and God is watching all of our actions, and everything we do is what makes a difference in the world. And of course, I think we'll put ourselves in a better place, and the world in a better place. And no doubt we are we'll make the world a better place by doing so. Perhaps that's just a little explanation or commentary on why Moshe translated the Torah into the 70 languages to share that universal message with all of mankind. Questions, my friends, before we conclude today? Okay, ladies and gents, please God, we'll see you all right here tomorrow. And hopefully we'll talk about the 9 days in preparation for Tisha B'Av, but of course to look at it in a positive perspective as well. Looking forward to see you all then. Sei gesund, stay healthy and well. Tomorrow, please. Yeah?
Question,
Yeah.
please. Something
Sure.
totally unrelated and totally to do with this. I've always wondered why we say the 3 verses of the Shema, and the last one is discussing wearing tzitzis. If women do not wear tzitzis, why do we have to say that 3rd verse?
Good point. So the idea, of course, is firstly, it reminds us about our exodus from Egypt. There's a few messages in there. The idea that tzitzis is to remind us of the mitzvahs all the time. Now, yes, it's true that women are exempt from any time-related mitzvahs, time-bound mitzvahs, but certainly I think the message of the Shema is relevant to everybody. So for example, the exodus of Egypt, as we read in the Shema, that it reminds us every day we have to break free from our constraints and limitations, the things that hold us back in life. So I think its message is there for everybody, just like not all men are obligated in every single mitzvah, and because certain mitzvahs are only for women, and certain mitzvahs are, we discussed many, many times here, only relevant in Israel, and certain mitzvahs are only for Kohanim, some are only for Leviim, some are only for agriculture. So I think its message is there for everybody. Even though, yes, it has the mitzvah of tzitzis, but there's more to the Shema.
Just something that crossed my mind. I mean, it's there to be said, got to be said, but I just wondered why.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem. Thank you. What's this question? When is a good time for non-Jews to learn Noahide laws? Are there consequences if one does not comply? Well, I think there's human consequences. I mean, we could see what happened. Take the Holocaust as an example, where people just did things based on their own thinking, on their own rationale, not on the Torah's. So the Rebbe, in fact, made a major campaign to influence the world, and Chabad Shluchim, it was one of the mitzvahs one of the campaigns the Rebbe had was that we should teach the world about the 7 Noahide laws, that the world should know about it. In fact, there's a company that makes denims called 7 for all of mankind, something like that, right? I think they have a shop here in Santon City. So I'm sure that the 7 for all of mankind is I don't know who owns it, but I'm assuming it's some Jewish people who thought, we have 7 for all of mankind. Each person will buy 7 pairs of jeans for themselves for the 7 days of the week. I don't know their idea behind it, but the 7 Noahide laws are universal. They're for all of mankind, and I do think that there are consequences if we don't keep those laws. They're basic laws, and everyone should be adhering to them. So the time is now, yes. Any questions anyone else has? Okay, we'll see you, please God, tomorrow.